Welcome back now to Face the Nation. We're going to pick up where we left off with a discussion of the racist videos that came out of a University of Oklahoma fraternity this week. Protests that continued in Madison, Wisconsin, where an unarmed black teenager was shot and killed by police last weekend, and in Ferguson, where 2 police officers were seriously wounded while managing protesters following the resignation of the police chief, which came after the Justice Department's damning report of racial bias there. And joining us now, Sherilyn Ifill, the president of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the president of the NAACP, Cornell William Brooks. Thank you all so much for coming. You know, this is actually the anniversary, the actual date when President Johnson made the famous "We Shall Overcome" speech. And then it was 5 months after that, of course, that the Voting Rights Act was passed. We had all these wonderful demonstrations last week down in Selma. President was down there, and yet all of these horrible things have happened this week. Mr. Brooks, how would you judge the state of race relations in America today, 50 years after that speech?
Certainly. We as a nation seem to be uncomfortably poised between our past and the present. It was my privilege to walk in Selma behind the president, between the president and Amelia Boynton, who 50 years ago was beaten down. She's 105 years now. The point being here is that much of the country, particularly some of our young people, don't seem to understand or remember or be aware of the history and what so many people had to go through in order for them to enjoy the rights they have today. Because if they understood, you would not be able to sing about lynching. 5,000 or so people were lynched in this country. So to have members of a fraternity sing about lynching in a cavalier way and associate lynching with exclusive policies with respect to membership, absolutely shocking.
Sherilyn, what is your take? You know, some of the residents who were interviewed in Ferguson this week said they didn't understand why people were still protesting down there. After all, I mean, they'd gotten rid of half the police force and the people there. Why do you think those demonstrations go on?
Well, in many ways, I think they have to go on because the work is not complete. In fact, we're at the moment where the work really has to push forward, and that is that the Department of Justice now is entering into negotiations with the leaders of Ferguson about how they're going to change that police department. And I think this is the time when the protests actually have to become more focused and more targeted in terms of thinking about what is the result that you want. Elections are next month in Ferguson, and you've got city council elections and African Americans running for city council seats at numbers they never did in the past. So there's a real opportunity for change, and I think the people who are out want to make sure that that change actually happens. There's a lot of work to be done, and I think this discomfort that we're all feeling actually, even though it feels like we're going backwards, that's actually when we go forwards. It's just like, you know, in Selma, it's just like on that Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's these moments of confrontation when we actually get to see what is really happening in America, whether it's that video that shocks us all and that's so repugnant. The most dangerous times for race in America is when we're papering over what the reality is.
Well, you know, things have been pretty quiet here in recent years, but then all of a sudden we have, you know, these police incidents in Ferguson, then in New York, now up in Wisconsin. Is this just coincidence, Mr. Brooks, or is there a connection here?
I don't believe it's a coincidence. I believe we're in a particular moment, if you will, a third reconstruction. We are at a point in American history where we can move forward or we can move backward. We have made tremendous progress in terms of voting rights, but we've seen tremendous challenges in terms of criminal justice reform and a backward movement with respect to voting rights. So we're at a moment where we need to catalyze these disparate protests around the country into a real movement for reform. In Ferguson, we have a handful of bills in the state legislature that would make a tremendous difference in terms of civilian review boards. We have in Congress a Voting Rights Act amendment that needs to be tweaked, needs to be improved, but we need to move forward on that because we're at a point where this country has to move forward. And you have a generation of young people who get it. They think we can do better. And I believe we can do better. And in fact, we need a Congress that is as engaged, as committed to our highest democratic and constitutional values as these young people on the streets.
Well, I actually don't think it's been quiet. I think actually in communities all over this country, African American communities, this is what people have been rolling against. And it's only that it's come to national consciousness, largely because of cell phone videos and other ways in which we've been able to see what people have been saying for years. So that's what's created the moment, the fact that it has now risen to national consciousness, and that's a good thing. There are things that can be done. We've got an End Racial Profiling Act that has been languishing in Congress for years that Congress needs to act on. Cornell just talked about the various bills that are in the Ferguson legislature, and we're also seeing a crisis of democratic governance. You know, the democratic structure of Ferguson is very much like the democratic structure of communities all over this country, with the part-time mayor that gets $350 a month and the part-time city council and the town manager who really has all the power. It's an opportunity for us to really look at representative government and to make real change. And that's the moment that Cornell's talking about. So rather than just sit with the discomfort, we really have to begin to dig in and work on change.
And Bob, I'll just note this, that the NAACP has launched what we call America's Journey for Justice, a series of demonstrations, direct actions from Selma, Alabama, across Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and into D.C. Why? Because we're trying to take advantage of this democratic upsurge in this country based upon real problems. When we think about the fact on the Voting Rights Act, 11% of the electorate doesn't have an ID, 25% of African Americans, and yet we see this frenzy of voter disenfranchisement all across the country. People are responding to real problems. When it comes to the criminal justice front, we've seen massive racial profiling. And so the point being here is we have people in this country who sense what is wrong, and they also sense what can be made right. And they know that Congress can act, but has failed to do so.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for bringing this to our attention on this really what is an historic day. Thank you so much. We'll be right back with our panel to talk about all of this and other stuff too. So stay with us. And we're back now with our panel. Joining us this week, Susan Page, who is USA Today's Washington bureau chief, the New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker, plus Bloomberg Politics managing editor John Heilemann, and Washington Post columnist Dana Milbank. Well, you heard the man of the hour here in Washington, Senator Tom Cotton, this 60 days in the United States Senate, and now he's at the top of every story. What did you make of this morning, Susan?
Well, he certainly didn't back off
No.
In response to your questions, including about whether he was next going to try to send a letter to the leaders of North Korea. You know, what's surprising to me is not that Tom Cotton would choose to write a letter like this. What's surprising to me is the most senior Republicans in the Senate, including the Senate Majority Leader, would sign such a letter. That is, as with the Netanyahu speech to a joint session of Congress, really the kind of steps we have not seen taken before in modern times.
Peter, what do you think Senator Cotton's, what was his objective here? To derail these talks?
I think in some ways, yes. I do think he feels strongly, and a lot of people in the Congress, in both parties actually feel strongly, that these talks are not leading to a deal that they feel they can support. His North Korea example as a precedent is actually a reasonable one to look at. Did that show that inspectors can do what we're asking inspectors to do this time around? What's interesting about it, though, is that it seems to jeopardize what had been a bipartisan skepticism. There are quite a number of Democrats who had signed on to legislation intended to force President Obama to come to them, and now they're kind of upset about this. They did not sign this letter, and it's actually the White House actually is kind of happy. Frankly, they played out this way.
Right. Now, clearly, Cotton has no regrets, but some of his fellow signatories are beginning to. We had John McCain this week blaming the weather, saying it was a snowstorm and we were rushing out of town and I didn't read the fine print. And I think they're realizing, yes, Cotton is well-intentioned in doing this, but it's backfiring. You know, and if the Ayatollah is going to give out his Ayatollah's Medal of Honor this year, I think Cotton's going to be a finalist because it gives them an excuse if they pull away from the agreement now, and the rest of the world's going to say, oh, well, it's the Senate of the United States' fault, making it more likely they're wrong.
You know, I was a little surprised. Here is a guy who is in Iraqi and Afghanistan, a veteran. He was in the military. He has an exemplary record. I just found the whole thing sort of surprising, John.
Well, you see some freshman senators who arrive in town and want to get on the map pretty quickly, and that seems to have been part of, it seems you've kind of sensed that that's part of his motivation. I think fascinating this week, listening to former foreign policy people from past Bush administrations, people like Richard Haass this morning, Michael Gerson, saying this is a huge mistake, and partly because of the thing that Dana's referring to, which is that if these talks fall apart, you want to be in a position to blame Iran for the talks falling apart. Now there is a plausible counter-narrative, if the talks fall apart, that it's a dissension on the U.S. side. And secondly, if they do fall apart, you're going to want to put back together and ratchet up the sanctions regime. And that requires huge international cooperation, and this makes it harder. So in the worst case scenario, that could be the biggest effect here. No, we get no deal, but it's harder then to keep pressure on Iran going forward.
One of the things that Secretary Kerry also talked about, in addition to this, when he talked to Margaret Brennan last night, was Syria and the whole situation there. And I want to just play a portion of what he said on that.
We are working very hard with other interested parties to see if we can reignite a diplomatic outcome. Why? Because everybody agrees there is no military solution. There is only a political solution. But to get the Assad regime to negotiate, we're going to have to make it clear to him that there is a determination by everybody to seek that political outcome and change his calculation about negotiating. That's underway right now. And I am convinced that with the efforts of our allies and others, there will be increased pressure on Assad.
And you'd be willing to negotiate with him?
Well, we have to negotiate in the end.
So there you hear the Secretary of State saying we may have to negotiate with Assad. Is that a change in the administration's position?
Well, it is in a way, because the condition had always been, through all of these negotiations that have taken place in the past on Syria with the Russians and others, was that Assad had to go and that he could not be a part of these conversations because, you know, except to negotiate his own withdrawal, in effect. So there is an implication in what Secretary Kerry just said, that Assad might in fact have room to remain in power in some sort of future talks.
It's probably not terribly helpful what Secretary Kerry just said, because it may be true as a matter that you have to negotiate a political solution, but they're trying to get an authorization for the use of force through the Congress now. So you can imagine Senator Cotton hearing that and pulling out his quill pen and dashing off another letter now to Assad and saying, watch out, man.
I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to predict that he doesn't do that.
But not after your questioning of it.
But he might do that. Let's talk about the other huge story of the week, and that is the Hillary Clinton email saga. What's going on here?
Well, I guess I think there's no voter who was on the fence about Hillary Clinton, and there, in fact, may be no voter who's on the fence about Hillary Clinton. But if there were one, I don't think the idea that she had her own server and her private email address as Secretary of State would sway anybody. But it does make us feel like, welcome to the new Clinton campaign, just like the old Clinton campaign, where we're going to have these kind of pitch battles, scandals, privacy, control, and that is, I think, not good news for Hillary Clinton, who really needs to be talking about the future. What is her vision? What would she do about income inequality? What would she do about Syria? So I think it's probably kind of disheartening for those of us who are going to spend the next 2 years of our lives covering this campaign.
You know, her husband famously says that's what campaigns are about. The campaigns are about the future and not the past. For a 67-year-old woman who has had the history she's had, and she has had an incredible history in American politics, for her to be demonstrating all of the kinds of traits that people associate with the worst aspects of the Clintons. There are many great aspects about the Clintons that people in America love, but there's other aspects about them people are uneasy with, and in particular, the notion that they play by their own rules. And that came through seeing that spectacle, seeing that press conference. All of that just revives memories that make, for people who have some unease about the Clintons, it revives all those memories, and it certainly makes her look, as Susan said, not like a candidate of the future, not like an avatar of the future, but like some kind of a relic from the 90s.
Right.
Well, what was the purpose here, Daniel? Was she just trying to make sure there's no paper trail here of her actions?
Well, maybe it was a convenience, as she said 10 or 15 times during that press conference. I don't think the particular email thing is a scandal or particularly damaging. It's been the way she's handled it, and that's what's given all of us who have covered these campaigns before some kind of PTSD, seeing this is going on again. Lanny Davis is out defending her on television, and oh my, you know, that not only is the server private, but we've destroyed some of the emails, and it just feels like the Rose Law Firm all over again. And if you want to get rid of this, yeah, it's unfair, the scrutiny, but if you want to get rid of it, you've got to come clean and move on.
To be clear, I don't think Americans care about how we react to it, right? That it's not
But
nice
they may
for
react
us.
to our cover.
But they react, yeah.
Or remember the Rose Law Firm.
Yes,
for that matter.
but it does definitely have that feel.
But to Dana's point, though, it may not be a huge scandal, but there has never been another Secretary of State or a Secretary of head of any other government any other government agency we know of that has done what she did, which was proactively at the very beginning decide I'm going to set up my own parallel information infrastructure in my house. And then after I leave office, I am going to be the sole judge and jury over what I'm going to release, and then I'm going to destroy everything else. I'm sorry, from the perspective of history, that just looks weird. It does not smell right, and it is unusual, to say the least.
And as President Obama said last night at the Gridiron Dinner, I didn't even know you could have your own server.
Let's just
He said, I thought I was the candidate of the technological future, and here's Hillary way out ahead of me.
let's take a break right here. We'll come back and talk about this and some other stuff. And back now with more from our panel. Well, we've talked about the Democrats. Hey, we've got to talk a little bit about the Republicans here. To me, the most interesting story of the week was the disclosure that Marco Rubio and Mitt Romney have suddenly become new best buddies. Now, mind you, Marco Rubio, his mentor was Jeb Bush. I can remember when people said, look, if Jeb Bush decides to run, there's no way that Marco Rubio is going to get in the same race because Jeb Bush was his mentor all in those Florida politics. And yet now we see something entirely different. John, what do you make of that?
Well, first of all, there is a part of the Republican establishment that likes Jeb Bush fine, but does not want to sacrifice the mantle of the future. They think if Hillary Clinton's going to be the nominee, we do not want to have another Bush running against her. And so there is an openness to someone who is of a younger generation, whether that's Scott Walker or Marco Rubio or someone else. So Marco Rubio is going to get a look. And you'll remember that when Mitt Romney announced that he was not going to make a third run, one of the things he said explicitly was that it was time for a new generation. And people read that as an implicit shot at Jeb Bush. So the fact that the two of them are now new best friends, BFFs, as you say, doesn't surprise me that much. I think he was leading us towards his support or potential support for Rubio in that statement.
You know, what's kind of interesting about that, Romney said that after it became clear that Jeb Bush was getting most of his big donors.
Yes.
And they had told Romney they were for him, and then suddenly they became supporters of Jeb
Not a lot
Bush.
of love lost between Romney world and Bush world.
It's always shocking to find disloyalty in politics, but it's happened once again with Marco Rubio. Now, I think what you have happening here is Jeb Bush is in that position that Romney was before him, and McCain was before him, and George W. Bush was before him, and that is he's the likely guy. He's going to be everybody's second choice, but first they have to flirt with all the others. They're going to have their Scott Walker flirtation. They'll get for their Marco Rubio flirtation, and all the others down the line when they realize we probably don't have a choice, and it's going to be Jeb Bush again.
Well, and why wouldn't Marco Rubio, by the way, take this chance? Right. Barack Obama proved that you don't have to be in the Senate for very long. You don't have to necessarily wait until you're wizened and spend 40 years in the trenches anymore. And in fact, sometimes you're better off not doing that because you have a cleaner record, you have less of a baggage to run. So it's a free shot for Marco Rubio. Why wouldn't he want to get out there and mix it up?
Also, you can very credibly see Marco Rubio. I realize he's running for president, but you can clearly see him as a potential vice presidential nominee on the Republican ticket. And at his age, he can afford to run for vice president and run for president down the road because he's a young man, he's Hispanic, and these are important assets in a Republican Party that's trying to look for a new direction.
You know,
Do you all think, though, at the end of the day, it's going to be Bush and Hillary Clinton? Because I got to tell you, I think they're both overwhelming favorites right now, but I'm not convinced it's a done deal on either side.
I've been saying now for about 2 months that I cannot construct a rational argument for why it will not be Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, and yet deep in my gut somehow, I don't believe that somehow they will be the nominees. I can't explain it, but it just, I somehow can't see it.
Politics is rarely a linear process, right? It's
And especially
rarely
when the Clintons are involved.
Right, from point A to point B, it's a simple boom, 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 boom. Things happen, surprises happen. You would have had a hard time put together a plausible argument just 3-4 years ago that Jeb Bush could have been a candidate even because of the fatigue with his brother and so forth. And yet here he is as the front runner. So I do think politics is
but it's
fluid.
hard even to see where the surprise will be. I spent some time with Martin O'Malley this week saying maybe he could be it, and it was just, you know, milquetoast O'Malley and, you know, talking about sewage treatment plants, and I'm thinking that's probably just not going to light the nation on fire.
I don't think it's going to be a Bush-Clinton race. I mean, I can't tell you what it is going to be, but it's too neat. We're too far out. We're always too wrong at this point to say what's going to happen. And while I think Hillary Clinton is definitely an overwhelming favorite for the Democratic nomination, only Hillary Clinton can cost her that. I think Bush is a fragile frontrunner when you talk about the Republican nomination.
He's a better retail candidate that people give him credit for, but between immigration, Common Core, and this sense of not another Bush, there's an opening there for some other Republican that somehow that alchemy will open the door to somebody else.
Wasn't there a Clinton, Rudy Giuliani race 8 years ago at the time?
Yes.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
We're all fairly sure, right?
Yeah.
What about Bibi Netanyahu? You know, it was such.
He probably will not run.
I'm beginning
But
to
maybe.
think
He
that.
gave a good speech.
Well,
But it was such a big deal when he came over and addressed the Congress, and now it seems to be kind of just swept away.
Well,
by
it
the
clearly
events
didn't
of
help
recent
him,
days.
and maybe it hurt him. But I think what needs to happen here is Tom Cotton needs to write a letter to the Israelis saying we will not recognize the results there unless Netanyahu is returned to power.
No one would be more pleased in the White House if Bibi Netanyahu does not get another time as prime minister there.
And now here is the question, and I'm sure you'll be able to help. Where is Vladimir?
Isn't that a
Does
great
anyone
question?
know?
Yeah. This is very unusual. Even in the old bad Soviet days when leaders died and it took them a while to make it public, it didn't last this long. So, look, he's probably not dead. Obviously, that's pretty hard to cover up. But he might be sick. He might not be presentable in that sense. He cultivates this macho, healthy image. If he had the flu, if he had some other stroke, some people have argued perhaps he would want to stay out of the public limelight for a little while. But this is something scary because this man is in such singular control of the only other country on the planet that could destroy us all that it's a pretty important moment. It's kind of funny, but it's also important.
Well, who knows? He may have come down with a flu, running around without his shirt and a hat. And, you know, he gets cold over there.
But hard to understand why they haven't had released a picture of him talking.
Shirtless
to
or
someone.
not.
Right.
Yes,
even,
right.
even an old one would be fine.
But they have, and they've misdated them actually to make it look like they're current dates. They took old pictures and said this is dated more
I
recently.
think they need to do a new picture, to be clear. Yeah.
if you all find out where he
I thought I
is,
saw him at your table last night at the Gridiron, but that was
find out
not
where
him.
he is, call me, okay?
All right.
It'll be news. And thank you all so much. We'll be back in just a minute. Well, that is all the time we have this week, so we want to thank you for watching and to tell you that we will see you next Sunday right here